welcome back once again to Biblical Greek Made Easy. This is class 4 of Module 2. Module 2 is all about the Greek verb, the ins and outs of the Greek verbal system and how we can deal with it and all of its weirdness, and we're going to see some of that today. Okay? The scripture verse I want to share with you today is Proverbs 23:33. It says, "Your eyes will see strange sights, and your mind will imagine confusing things." And today's class, the second chapter we're going to look at today, is kind of all about the weirdness of a certain tense of the Greek verb. And there's a lot of weirdness going on, and I just want to prep you for that. Remember, Proverbs said that you'll see some confusing things, and you might feel that that's super true today as we're going through this. But I want you to take heart. We're going to deal with this together. I'm going to make this as easy as possible for you. I'm going to provide you with the handouts that you need to study these and become familiar with these. And that brings us to our tip of the day. Okay, our tip of the day today is to deal with the weird, and it won't seem so weird. Okay? We are going to see some new things, some things where you just go, what on earth is that? Why does it behave that way? Right? As my Greek teacher used to say, it is not for you to question how Greek does it, right? We kind of don't get to do that with language, especially an ancient language that's so long ago. We just kind of have to deal with it where it's at, okay? But if we deal with the weird, in other words, if we take it on its terms, if we look at it, if we study it a little bit, if we just sit with it for half a shake, then after a while it doesn't become so weird anymore. The things that show up a lot, we just start to memorize. Think about all the weirdness that English has. When you start studying English, English breaks rules all the time. It's the international language in the world, and so it has all these shortcuts. If you talk to somebody who's learning English as a second language, it's really difficult, right? Greek is not nearly as weird as English, right? So that's what we want to do, is we want to deal with the weird on its terms, and then in that process, it won't seem so weird, okay? What we can't do is we can't give up because things get a little bit hard, okay? We need to push through, we need to fight through, we need to do our very best. And so that's what we're here to do, all right? So with that, let's go ahead and jump in to the class today. Today we're going to look at the 4 patterns of the future, okay? And I want you to note that in this class, we actually cover 2 chapters in the Mounts textbook. So if you're following along, if you're reading along in the Mounts textbook, we're actually covering 2 chapters, chapter 19 and chapter 20. Okay, chapter 19 is all about the future tense. We're going to look at future, active, and middle. And then chapter 20 is about these other patterns, the weird patterns of the future that we need to look at. And this is the first time we're really going to encounter these. We saw contract verbs that behave a little bit differently. We saw oida, for example, that behaves a little bit weird. But we have a whole chapter dedicated to the weirdness of the future tense. And I've sort of hinted at you before that this is going to be the struggle when it comes to Greek verbs. The stuff that plays by the rules, the regular stuff, that's not going to be that big of a deal. Okay, you can master that, you can get that down before too long. It's the weird verbs that pop up, that change their form, that do strange things. That's what's going to be harder. And so we just need to be aware of that. One of the techniques I've suggested maybe you do is flip to the back page of your notebook and just make a list of the weird verbs. When you come across one that just doesn't behave the way that you think it should, put it on there, and that can be a source of regular study time for you. Every time you study, you can flip to the back page and just look over those. And what's going to happen before too long, you're going to know those weird verbs so well that they're not going to be weird anymore, okay? And so they're just extra grace required, extra attention needed kind of verbs that we deal with on their terms, and we give them space to be weird. Okay? So with that, let's talk about why this matters. So future verbs are the first tense outside of the present that we learn. Everything we've learned so far, we learned present active indicative, and then we learned contract verbs, which were also present active indicative that just had some weird vowel changes going on in the middle. And then we learned present middle passive indicative, but we're still dealing with the present, okay? We're adding a layer each week. This week, the layer we're going to add is we're changing the tense. It's the second of the 5 tenses we're going to learn in the indicative mood, and that's the future, okay? And future isn't hard to conceptualize because we think about it in English all the time. We say, I will go, or I will learn, or I will study. That's the future tense, okay? And you also get introduced this class period to the tense formative, which is something that's going to keep coming up in Greek in the verbal system that we're studying, okay? So let's get going. So far, all the verbs we've learned have been present. We mentioned that before. That's what we've learned so far. In this chapter, we're going to learn future verbs, verbs that occur in future time. So remember that tense is talking about that time element. And so in English, we're going to use the helping word will to translate. That's how we change tense in English, is by adding helping words. In Greek, we're just going to change the form. It's simpler in that sense, that we're just going to change the form of the actual word, and it's going to change the tense, okay? Now note, the situation with future Greek verbs is a rare instance where aspect is not as important as tense, okay? In most tenses, we aspect, and remember what we said aspect was, it's that either continuous or undefined, continuous or completed action are some of the words that we've used. So the difference between I study and I am studying, the second one there, I am studying, is continuous, okay? And in most verb tenses in Greek, the aspect is more important than the tense, than the time element, okay? Future is an exception to that rule. In future, the time overwhelms the aspect, okay? So we're going to translate all of our futures as undefined. We'll just say, I will see, as opposed to I will be seeing, or I will go instead of I will be going, right? And that's just kind of how we do it. That's how we understand the way that the Greek comes across to English in that sense, okay? Now, future verbs, I mentioned to you before, actually have 4 patterns that they follow. Now, don't be overwhelmed by that, okay? 3 of them are somewhat rare. There's kind of the normal pattern, which is pattern 1, and then the 3 others that we'll kind of break down in some different categories. And I think I mentioned to you before that pattern 1 is its own chapter, and then the other 3 are a second chapter. We're going to talk about both of them today. So let's go ahead and build the future active indicative tense combo, and here's what we're looking at, okay? So we start out with the future active tense stem. And note, this is going to be the same stem that we saw in the present, okay? So if we're dealing with the verb luo, it's just going to be that lu stem, lambda upsilon, okay? Then we're going to add something called a tense formative. A tense formative is a letter that we add to the middle of a verb that is going to tell us something about the tense. It's a formative letter. It's a signaler that something's going on. And when I say the middle of the word, I mean at the end of the stem and before the ending is what I mean. Okay? That's the middle. The end of the stem and before the ending. Okay? So in this case, for future, the tense formative is going to be a sigma, okay? So we're going to add that sigma to the middle. Then we're going to add a connecting vowel. Remember, connecting vowels are fine. They're just there to smooth out translation because our ancient Greek ancestors thought that it sounded better. And then finally, we're going to put the ending on. Now, we're still dealing with our primary active endings. These are endings that you already know, okay? You saw these with present active indicative endings as well. So, for example, the first person plural ending is going to be men. So we get lusamen, okay? Lusamen, as you see on the screen there. Now, if you saw lusamen in context, okay, hopefully you would notice the tense formative that's there. Hopefully you would recognize the ending. Hopefully you could recognize what verb this comes from by seeing the lexical form. And if you do that, you just take the parts, you let the verb tell you what it is and what it's doing, and you go with it from there, okay? Is there a chance that the sigma could be part of the ending? Well, no, because we don't know any endings that are samen like that, right? Is it possible that the sigma is part of the stem? Well, maybe if we knew of a verb that had lus as its stem, but we don't in this case, do we? So that's why we got to know our vocabulary really well to go along with the grammar, because that combo is how we're going to identify these things, okay? So let me show you the full paradigm here. Here it is on the screen. Once again, present active on the left. Luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, luusi. Hopefully you're getting good at reciting that off the top of your head from memory, like a tool in a tool belt you can whip out whenever you need it. Then on the right there, you see the future active, okay? Luso, luseis, luce, lusamen, lusate, and lususi or lususin. Notice the movable nu there once again. As you look up and down there, what do you notice? Yeah, you may notice that it's exactly the same as the present active indicative. It just has that sigma in there. That's the only difference, okay? That sigma is going to hopefully scream to you that it's future. So how do we translate those? Luso is I will loose or I will destroy. Luseis is you singular, you will loose or you will destroy. Luce is he, she, it will loose or he, she, it will destroy. Lusamen, we will loose or we will destroy. Lucete, you, plural, you all, will loose or will destroy. And then lususin, they will loose or they will destroy. Okay? That's how it goes. And again, adding that sigma makes all the difference. Okay? Now, one wrinkle to notice, if we're dealing with a contract verb, and remember I told you those would come up regularly, we just need to be aware that there's a little weirdness that goes on. If we have a contract verb, since we have that connecting vowel weirdness, we have some contraction going on, we're going to have a lengthening of the vowel right before the sigma. That's the tense formative, okay? So the future first person singular form of agapao, for example, is agapeso. So rather than the aso ending, we just get that lengthening right before. Now that's actually fairly common before that sigma. You're going to see that lengthening quite a bit. So you get agapeso, which means I will love. Okay? So then for poieo, you get the lengthening before the tense formative, and you get poieso. Poieso means I will do or I will make. Okay? So just notice, just be on the lookout for that. Don't let that throw you. Remember, we've learned already that sometimes vowels change their length. It's called ablaut, and we let it happen. We're aware of it. We don't feel like we need to memorize every instance of that. We just have some mental flexibility for when that comes up. Okay? Now, since we're dealing with sigmas, we're going to have some weirdness going on when the sigma combines with another consonant. Remember, we call this the square of stops, okay? So if we have a verb like blepo, for example, which means I see, and we use the stem, which is blep, and we add a sigma on the end for the tense formative, we're going to get blepso, but rather than the P sigma, that P sigma is going to morph into the psi, right? Its own letter. So it's kind of like if we had a KS in English, if we always turn that into an X, right? Not the same sounds here, but that's kind of what's going on, okay? Or for grapho, same thing. If we put a sigma after the phi in grapho, we're going to get gropso. So the trick is then, when you see blepso or gropso in context, you're just going to need to recognize, I don't see a sigma, but it's really in there. There's a sigma hiding in that letter, and that has to be the sign to me that this is a tense formative. This is a future verb. Blepso means I will see. Gropso means I will write. And then one more example there, baptizo, you see. If we add the sigma to the end of that, actually the delta and the zeta drop out, and we just get baptizo. Okay? That means I will immerse or I will baptize. Okay? So be aware of that. The square of stops, by the way, that's not irregular. That's not an anomaly. That's not weird. That's just the way it works. Every time we see a sigma come up next to a P, for example, we're going to see that square of stops change happen. Okay? Now, let's talk about future middle indicative, okay? Now, we're not talking about future Future passive is going to be in a future class period where we learn that on its own, actually with something else. It's formed much like the aorist passive, but that's down the road. We're not going to worry about that right now. So we're just learning the future middle, or you might also think future deponent, okay? Remember, deponent, we said before, was a verb that has a middle passive form, but is active in meaning, okay? So let's go ahead and build this. We take the future middle passive tense stem, which again is same as the present. We put our tense formative in there. We put our connecting vowel in there. And then we use the primary middle passive personal endings, which again you already know. It's the bottom left of the chart that we've seen before. And we get lu plus sigma plus omicron plus the ending my. We get lucami. Okay, you see that? Now, if you saw lucami in context, hopefully you'd recognize that it was luo. Hopefully you would see the sigma in the middle of the word before the ending. And then hopefully you would see the my ending, which is the first person middle passive ending. And you'd be able to say, oh, okay, I will loose myself, or I will destroy myself, right? So we have the future element, but we have that middle translation. Remember, middle, that we default to that reflexive idea where the subject is involved in, the action of the verb and receiving the action of the verb, okay? And again, middle's kind of new. We'll talk about that more as time goes on, but just be aware of that. Okay, and so here's what that paradigm looks like. You see the present middle on the left, luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, luesta, luantai. And then you see the future middle on the right, lusamai, luse, lusatai, lusamatha, lusesta, lusantai. You probably noticed that that's exactly the same, just with the sigma in the middle, signaling you that this is a future tense verb. Okay, so we're going to trust the tense formatives, and we're going to trust the endings too, but we're going to trust the tense formatives to tell us what's going on. Okay, so at this point we're going to transition to what is chapter 20 for mounts. We've covered already the first pattern of the future. You can think about those as the regulars, the normal way that future verbs behave. And now let's talk about the weird ways sometimes they behave. Okay, and so we need to learn the weirdness, which is we sometimes call patterns 2 through 4. Now, mounts suggest that you distinguish between the stem and the root. You may find this as a helpful difference to note, and you may not, okay? But the root always stays consistent. The root of the word will stay the same. If we have something that changes, we're going to call that the stem. The stem can change, but the root cannot. Okay? So a verb only has one root, even though it might have different stems. And I know you haven't seen any examples of that yet, so let's go ahead and talk about that. Let me give you an example right now, actually. So balo, for example, means I throw. Like a ball, right? You throw a ball. Balo means I throw. Okay? Now, if it gets modified, like you see in the second example, balo with just one lambda, okay, that is a stem change, but the root is still the same. So the beta alpha lambda is the root. The beta alpha lambda lambda that you see above is a stem. The beta alpha lambda is also working as a stem. Okay? This may or may not be helpful for you. If you want to make a note of this, fine. Don't waste too much brain power on this. If there's smoke coming out of your ears, don't worry about it too much. I'm not sure that this is absolutely necessary to know. Again, mounts is really particular on knowing these different parts and exactly how things work. And that's fine if your brain's wired that way. I'm more of a functional learner. I want to see how it ends up on the page. And so just be aware of that, okay? So you see here that the root is beta alpha lambda, and it has a couple different stems. You can read the fuller explanation that Mounts gives on pages 209 and 210 if you would like. Okay, so pattern 1 we saw already. This is where the root is not modified. This is what we would call the regular form, and we've seen this already, like luo, blepo. Luo becomes luso, blepo becomes blepso, and we've got the square of stops there with blepo, no big deal. Okay, now pattern 2 we call a different root That's the pattern here. So you notice that some words have a totally different root in the future. This is not a stem change issue. It's like a completely different word when it switches to the future tense, okay? And so let me give you some examples. Harao is a verb that means I see. When it moves into the future tense, it becomes opsamai. When it goes into the future, it becomes essentially a completely different word. Okay? First of all, notice that some of the letters have changed. Okay? It's come from a rho alpha to a psi omicron. Okay? Before that ending. And also notice the ending. In the future, it's become deponent. Okay? In the future, harao is deponent. Is that weird? Yes, it is. Okay? There's not too many words that are regular in the present and deponent in the future, but this is one of them. This is the only one I can think of. There's maybe one or two others that I can't think of off the top of my head. But again, just put this on the back page. Let's deal with the weird, and in time it won't seem so weird. Okay? It'll become more common to us. So actually, harao means I see. Opsamai means I will see. And that's the word actually where we get the word ophthalmology, which is the eye doctor. When you go to get your eye doctor, you're going to your ophthalmologist. That's where we get this word, okay? The second example there, erkomai, one of the most common verbs in the New Testament, okay? When it goes into the future, it becomes elusamai, okay? So still deponent in both the present and the future, okay? We don't have that weirdness. But we have this different stem. Notice that it goes from epsilon rho chi to epsilon lambda epsilon upsilon, okay? And then we have the sigma on the end. This one's always been fairly easy for me to remember. For some reason, I'm just able to associate this with erkomai, elusamai with erkomai. That sigma helps remind me that it's future, that this is the future form of erkomai. Again, put this in the back, look it over, study it, and be aware that it shows up. So elusamai means I will come or I will go. Okay? And then finally, Lego becomes arrow in the future. How do you know this? That's when you just have to memorize. Really, all of these, you just have to spend some time and memorize them. But Lego means I say, arrow means I will say, or I will speak. Okay? So be aware of that. These are strange. These are weird. Now, let me give you some good news. There are only 9 pattern 2 verbs that show up in the New Testament, okay? So this isn't a problem you have to deal with a lot, at least many different words. But let me give you the bad news. These words, these 9 that are pattern 2, they show up a lot, okay? Like, for example, Lego. Lego shows up a ton, okay? It's going to show up in the future form a handful of times, and so we just need to be aware of them. You can memorize these 9 words, and you're done, right? If you just make vocabulary cards with the different conjugations of these, you have kind of your own special stack, you review them, every day for a little while, and then once a week or so. This will be an old hat, won't be a big deal. Like I said, if we deal with the weird, it won't be so weird, okay? Remember, that's the tip of the day, all right? Now let's talk about pattern 3. Pattern 3 is somewhat famous among Greek students. This is just kind of bonkers and kind of weird, but again, we'll just deal with it. Once you learn the rules, it makes it a little bit simpler. But pattern 3 is what we call liquid futures, okay? Now there's 4 consonants in Greek that we call liquid consonants, okay? And that's lambda, mu, nu, and rho. Okay? Lambda, mu, nu, and rho. So if one of those 4 letters shows up as the last letter in the verbal root, what's going to happen is the sigma is going to drop out from the word. Now that may seem confusing because the sigma, the tense formative for the future, that's the primary way we've identified the future, isn't it? But those liquid consonants are going to make that sigma drop out. So these liquid futures are going to be a little trickier, but there are some hints we can look at. Now let's go ahead and look at meno there, the example at the bottom. So the word meno means I remain. Okay, I remain. Notice that the last consonant in the stem is a nu. Is that one of our liquid consonants? Yes, it is. Okay, so that puts us on high alert. Okay, if we see a verb with a liquid consonant at the end of its stem, we're going to be on high alert for weird stuff happening. Okay, so there's no sigma there, but what do you notice? What's different between meno and then the one on the right that says meno? Well, right, the accent has changed. We now have a circumflex over the omega. We've seen circumflexes before, haven't we? And they've told us that contraction has taken place. That's kind of what's going on here too. The circumflex is tipping us off to let us know that something weird happened. Okay? And so here's going to be the 3 tests to determine that you're dealing with a liquid future. Okay? Number 1, the last letter of the root is a liquid consonant. Okay? The last letter of the root is a liquid consonant. So you just need to know lambda, mu, nu, rho. Those are your liquid consonants. That's going to put us on high alert that some weird stuff might be happening. Number 2, there's a circumflex over the last vowel. Once again, we've seen this before, where when we see a circumflex, it tells us, it's signaling to us, it's calling to us in the night, saying something has changed. Sometimes that's important to us, like here, and sometimes it's just kind of detail, like with contract verbs, but it's going to be important to know that something has changed in this case. Namely, that there was a sigma that dropped out. Okay? And then finally, and this one's important, and this one is one you might not hear in certain Greek context, but number 3 is that, oh yeah, this is one of those annoying liquid verbs that we learned on pages 460 and 461. That's where you can find the list. Also, our handout provides a list for you as well. But it has to meet those 3 qualities. It has to have a liquid consonant at the end of its root. It has to have a circumflex over the last vowel. And then it has to show up in that list. Why those 3 things? Why do we need that third one? There will be times where you'll see a verb that shows up with a liquid consonant at what appears to be the end of the root, but it's not a liquid. Why? Again, that's just kind of how Greek does it. There's going to be some exceptions there. So that's why if we just spend some time dealing with these verbs, that'll really help us. Now, there are 24 liquid verbs that show up in the New Testament, okay? And about 9 of these are pretty common. So I would say just practice the 9 of these, and the others you'll catch on as time goes by, okay? But we'll start with those 9 as they come to you, and we'll just be aware of those, okay? I also want you to note that the second form in the lexicon shows you what the future form looks like, okay? So when you look a word up in the lexicon, there's the actual word you're looking up, like luo or whatever, and then you're going to notice that in parentheses, it gives you a whole bunch of other forms. That next one, that first one after the parentheses, the second form that shows up, that's what the future looks like. So if you're not sure if a word is a future, you can always look it up in a lexicon and see what the future looks like, and that will tell you. Does the future have a sigma or not? That's going to give you, if all else fails, that's one thing you can do. Okay? So let me show you a paradigm for pattern 3. This is meno that we looked at before. Notice on the left-hand side, this is our present active. This is going to be pretty straightforward. Meno, menes, mene, menomen, menete, menusen, or menusi, movable nu there. Look at the future active. Meno, menes, mene, menumen, menete, menusen. Okay? Notice we have a vowel changing to a diphthong in the second person plural there. But other than that, it's very, very similar. If you saw meno on the right-hand side, or menes with no sigma but with the circumflex, would you be able to recognize that? Okay? Would you be able to go through the steps and say, okay, let's see, this is a verb that has a nu in the middle of it, so I'm kind of on edge, and oh, I see there's a circumflex, and you know what, this showed up on that list of liquid verbs, that handout that we looked at. Oh, this is a liquid future. Would you be able to identify that? Okay? Maybe not at first, but as time goes by, that's the hope. Okay? So I encourage you to spend some time with this, spend some time recognizing these. And by the way, those 9 liquid verbs that show up are are common enough that you just start to remember them, right? So Menno shows up enough that when Menno shows up, you're already on edge, knowing that this may be a future. You're just going to be on the lookout for liquid futures. Okay? The other thing you got to watch out for is when present tense Menno shows up that we don't think it's a liquid future. Sometimes that happens too. That students are so on edge looking for futures that they see futures where they don't even show up, right? Remember what we said in Proverbs today, that your eyes will see confusing things. That's kind of what's going on here, okay? So we just got to press in. We got to keep going until the weird becomes not so weird anymore, okay? Now, let me show you the middle. This is the same word, just in the present middle and the future middle. Again, we get menomai, mene, menetai, menamatha, menestha, menantai. And then the future middle, menumai, mene, menetai, menumatha, menestha, menuntai. Okay, once again, a couple diphthong changes there to help us, to tip us off that it's a little bit different. Not sure if you're going to notice that in context, but hopefully what you will recognize in context, you'll recognize the liquid consonant, the circumflex, and you'll remember this from that chart, that handout of 9. Okay? Sometimes there will be stem change hence as well. We saw that with the vowels a little bit, but look at these couple examples here. Apostello becomes apostello, but notice that it dropped a lambda, okay? So a lambda is a liquid consonant, and we have the circumflex in the future, okay? But it also dropped a lambda, okay? So that can be a hint. If it looks a little bit off, if the word looks a little shorter, like something's changed, that can be a hint for us. And look at the second example there. Ballo means I throw. Ballo with one lambda and a circumflex means I will throw. Iro becomes aro. Now I want you to notice something, that iro is one of those that shows up in a couple different categories. And this is one of the problems with Mounce's patterns, is that they're kind of blurred. The Venn diagrams for these 3 patterns overlap a little bit. And so you just got to be careful. That's why I think at the end of the day, going over these weird verbs on a regular basis is the best way to get comfortable with them. Yeah, we can learn rules and patterns. All of that stuff definitely can be helpful. But at the end of the day, we want to deal with the verbs that are going to show up the most, okay? And in my opinion, learning the 9 liquid verbs and the 9 pattern 2 verbs, just becoming familiar with those is the best way to go from point A to point B, which is reading the New Testament with confidence. Okay? Now let's talk about pattern 4. There's a lot of stuff going on in pattern 4 that we want to be aware of, okay? But you might think of this pattern as like the not otherwise specified group, where there's just weird things that happen that kind of don't fit into any other category. So let's go ahead and look. You see iro again. We just saw iro as an example of a liquid verb. Mounce has it in both, because notice it's got a stem change on the front, but it also has a liquid consonant that it doesn't take a sigma. So like the front half is pattern 4, the back half is pattern 3, right? The second one there, gnosko, is kind of the same way. Notice we have a stem change kind of on the front. It loses the iota, and we get gnosamai. We do have the sigma there to help us know that it's a future. By the way, gnosko means I know, like K-N-O-W. That's the second verb we've encountered that means I know, along with oida, okay? An agnostic comes from this word, somebody who doesn't have knowledge, okay? The Gnostics from the 1st century, more 2nd century, I suppose, the heretical group early on comes from this word, the word gnosis, the noun version that means knowledge, okay? And then the third example there, baptizo, when we add the sigma, well, it changes and becomes baptizo. Okay, so that's kind of a square of stops things, but there is a change going on at the end that we want to be aware of. All right, so let's go ahead and review. We learned future verbs, okay? We encountered tense formatives as well. Tense formatives is that sigma. It's not always going to be a sigma when we look at other options, other tenses and stuff, but for the future, the sigma is the tense formative that's screaming at us, it's hollering at us, and letting us know that this is a future verb. We also learned 4 patterns of the future. Pattern 1 is our favorite because it's regular, it's not weird, it's not strange, it keeps everything pretty regular. And then we learned patterns 2 through 4 that are kind of doing a different thing. How many of you are like me and maybe you identify more with patterns 2 through 4? You're maybe a little bit of a rule breaker, you like to rebel a little bit. That's what patterns 2 through 4 are doing. They're following their own rules, the beat of their own drummer, and there's only a handful of them, but the ones that do show up in the New Testament show up a lot, and so for that reason we need to get comfortable with liquid, with different roots, that sort of thing. And so we need to just review those. And we also got a glimpse into the weirdness that the Greek verb can bring, okay? And we're going to see more of this. It's probably most profound in the future, although every tense that we learn is just going to have some weirdness going on that we have to be aware of. Okay? So keep going, fight through. This is one of those lessons that you might have to watch a couple times. You might have to do some practice. Make sure you're looking at the handouts, you're working on the bonus videos, you're doing the homework, you're doing everything you can to get reps on this because we want you to be comfortable in dealing with these future verbs. Until next time, we'll see you. Happy studying and God bless.